The first of the three chord theorems we're going to take a look at tells us that if we have two congruent chords, as you can see in this diagram, we also have two congruent arcs, or vice versa. So what I often try to do is match up my diagrams so they look kind of like this sample diagram. If you can find two chords are congruent, then there are also two arcs that are congruent. So down here there aren't any tick marks, however I can see that both chords are labeled 9 units, so I can add tick marks telling me that those two chords are the same length. Well, as we just talked about then, these two arcs are also going to be congruent to each other. So that's what I mean by adding tick marks so it matches the diagram. The sentence up here tells me that arc AB is 110 degrees, and since we just talked about this, I know that arc BC is also 110 degrees using this theorem. We can take a look at a couple more examples using that same theorem. I can see in this diagram, and we've made them a little more complicated, or at least as complicated as we can make these problems, I have two congruent chords, which means I've got these two arcs that are also going to be congruent to each other. Well, let's take a look at what else I know. I know this time I have a central angle of 75 degrees. As we've discussed in the past, central angles are congruent to the arc they cut off. So that arc's going to be 75 degrees, and since both arcs are the same, I know this side will also be 75 degrees, arc AB, the red one that they asked me about. Some people also in class noticed they could do this problem a different way. They notice there's vertical angles right there in the center, so I can label that central angle 75, which means this arc over here, for another reason, is also 75 degrees. It's kind of hard to make these problems hard, as you can see. Over here, once again, I have no tick marks, but the chords are the same length. They're both labeled 34. So I'll add tick marks to show that those two chords are congruent, which tells me then that these two arcs are congruent. Now just be careful on this one. Even though this arc over here is labeled 128 degrees, that doesn't mean the red arc is 128 degrees. This arc over here is not congruent to the other two. Instead, they're congruent to each other. So doing a little bit of thinking, I know that there's 360 degrees total in the circle. If I subtract off the arc that they gave me, the 128, I'm left with 232 degrees. Oops. Well, we'll fix it like that. 232 degrees, and because those two arcs that are left over need to be equal, I know that I need to divide that in half to split it equally between those. So each of those arcs is going to be 116 degrees.